What are some interesting rabbit holes you've recently explored? Story 1. Imagine you have a memory, a cartoon you watched as a kid, a song that played in a mall in 2003, a clip you saw once on YouTube at 2 a.m. that made you feel genuinely unsettled. You tell people about it, and they look at you like you need help. You search for it and find nothing. Absolutely nothing. Like it never existed at all. Welcome to Lost Media, the dark corner of the internet where people spend years, sometimes entire decades, hunting down TV episodes that aired once and vanished, songs that got deleted before anyone could rip them, old internet videos that predated the Wayback Machine, and footage that exists only in the memories of people who were there. There's an entire wiki dedicated to this. Thousands of entries. Some go back to the 1920s. We're talking about missing Doctor Who episodes, a supposedly cursed Nickelodeon pilot, a McDonald's training video that people describe in disturbing detail, but nobody can prove existed. The communities around these are obsessive in the best possible way. Volunteer archivists, retired VHS collectors, people cold calling former TV network employees like detectives who never got assigned a case. And here's the part that should unsettle you slightly. They find things regularly. A long-lost Disney short recovered from a Norwegian film archive. A Radiohead demo that leaked after 18 years of searching. An episode of a 90s kids show recovered from a former crew member's garage in Ohio. Which means the question isn't just, what is lost? The real question is, what has been found that nobody's told us about yet? Because if a grainy VHS of a local car dealership ad from 1987 can be hunted down and restored by 30 strangers on the internet who never met each other, what exactly do you think is still out there in someone's basement, waiting? Story 2. At some point in the last decade, someone in Utah figured out that Lego sets are basically untraceable cash. No serial numbers on individual bricks, no way to prove a set was stolen once it's been opened. Retail prices are high, resale demand is insane, and every Target and Walmart in America just leaves them sitting on a shelf behind a thin plastic security tag that a coat sleeve can defeat in about 2 seconds. So, what started as petty shoplifting turned into something that looks, if you squint at it right, like an actual organized crime operation. Crews of people, sometimes families, sometimes whole social networks, systematically hitting stores across multiple states, loading up on the most valuable sets, and funneling them into resale markets on Amazon, Facebook Marketplace, and eBay. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some estimates say millions across multiple busts. Now here's where it gets strange. A disproportionate number of the people arrested in these cases and documented across Reddit threads, court records, and local Utah news that nobody outside Utah ever read, kept coming back. Charges filed, cases dropped, charges refiled, mysteriously resolved. People in the community started noticing patterns, prosecutors going soft, investigations stalling, connected families, connected lawyers, connected church networks that stretch in Utah into basically every institution that matters. Nobody is saying the LDS Church is running a Lego theft ring. To be clear, that would be insane. But what people are saying is that in a state where roughly 60% of the population shares the same religious community, the same social circles, and the same informal obligation to look out for each other, the line between community loyalty and institutional protection gets very blurry, very fast. And somewhere in that blur, a man in a suburb of Salt Lake City has a garage full of unopened Millennium Falcons, and absolutely nothing has happened to him. Story 3. Most people hear an Appalachian accent and assume they're listening to someone uneducated, someone rural, someone who just never quite got the language right. And that assumption is one of the most embarrassing mistakes a person can make, because what they're actually hearing is English that predates the American Revolution. When Scots-Irish settlers moved into the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains in the 1700s, the mountains did what mountains do. They isolated everything inside them. No major roads in, no cultural churn, no outside pressure to update, modernize, or standardize. While the rest of the English-speaking world was busy evolving its language, Appalachia just kept going, preserved, like a linguistic amber. The word yonder, as in over yonder, that's not a hillbilly invention. That's a word Shakespeare used. Afeard, meaning afraid, appears in King Lear. Ain't was considered perfectly acceptable grammar in 17th century Britain. The double modal, I might could do that, she used to would, is a grammatical structure that linguists have traced directly back to Ulster Scots dialect. These people didn't corrupt the English language. They kept it while everyone else moved on and then got mocked for it. And there's something quietly devastating about that. An entire region of people who preserved something rare and irreplaceable, whose speech patterns are now studied in linguistics departments as a kind of living fossil record, and whose accent, for most of American history, has been the punchline of every joke about backwardness and ignorance. The most Shakespearean English left on earth is spoken in a holler in Kentucky, and the people speaking it have been told their whole lives that they sound dumb. Story 4. Every time someone says the government would never do that, I think about Donald Ewan Cameron. Not because he's obscure, not because his story is disputed, but because everything he did is documented, declassified, and sitting in public records, and most people have never heard his name. Cameron wasn't a fringe figure. He had an MD with distinction. He was president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association, often simultaneously. He was the most credentialed psychiatrist on the continent. He was the kind of man who got invited to Nuremberg to help evaluate German war criminals, the kind of man whose opinion on the human mind was considered the final word. And in his Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, funded covertly by the CIA under MKUltra Sub-Project 68, he spent years trying to erase people's minds and rewrite them from scratch. His theory was elegant in the way that truly monstrous ideas sometimes are. The human personality is just programming. Wipe it clean, and you can rebuild it however you want. A blank slate. Total control. To get there, he subjected patients, many of them children, many admitted voluntarily for mild depression or anxiety. None of them told what was actually happening, to weeks of drug-induced sleep, massive electroconvulsive shocks at up to 40 times the normal clinical dose, and looped audio recordings played into their ears for 16 hours a day. He called it psychic driving. What it produced was retrograde amnesia so severe that grown adults forgot how to speak, forgot their children's names, forgot how to use a toilet. He never achieved the blank slate. What he achieved instead was documented, irreversible brain damage in dozens of people who came to him for help. He died in 1967 on a hiking trip, professionally celebrated, never charged with a single crime. The CIA destroyed most of the MKUltra files in 1973. The ones that survived were found by accident in a misfiled box in 1977. The most decorated psychiatrist in the world was running a CIA-funded torture program on children in Canada. And the reason you're only hearing about it now is that someone forgot to shred one box. Story 5. In 1877, Ulysses S. Grant finished his second term as President of the United States, walked out of the White House, and decided to do something that no former head of state in American history had ever attempted. He went everywhere, all of it, the whole world, for 2.5 years. To understand how strange this was, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1877. There were no commercial flights, no international phone lines, no Secret Service protection for former presidents. Communication between continents took weeks, and the United States, despite winning a civil war and industrializing at breakneck speed, was still very much considered a young provincial country by the old powers of Europe and Asia. Interesting, perhaps, but not quite serious. Not quite one of them. Grant went to England and was received by Queen Victoria. He went to Bismarck's Germany. He met the Pope. He went to Egypt and floated down the Nile. He traveled through the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan, where Emperor Meiji, who almost never granted private audiences to foreign visitors, sat with Grant personally and asked his advice on how a nation modernizes without losing itself to foreign domination. Grant, the former general, the former president, a man with no official title and no formal authority, was being consulted by emperors on geopolitics. Because here's what nobody fully appreciates about that tour. Grant wasn't traveling as a tourist. He was traveling as a symbol. Every banquet held in his honor, every military salute, every private meeting with a head of state was a message sent back across the Atlantic that the United States produced this kind of man, that a republic could generate someone the whole world wanted to meet. He came home in 1879 to a crowd of 100,000 people in San Francisco. He had no office, no title, and no power. He was just a man who had shaken hands with essentially every significant leader on Earth, and in doing so, quietly told the world that America had arrived. History remembers Grant for the scandals in his administration and for the Civil War. It almost entirely forgets the 2 years he spent doing more for American soft power than any diplomat, treaty, or warship ever had. One steamship at a time, with no playbook because nobody had ever done it before. Story 6. In 2003, DARPA, the U.S. military's advanced research agency, the same people who built the early internet, launched a program called LifeLog. The goal, stated openly in their own documents, was to build a system that could record the entirety of a person's life. Every conversation, every location, every purchase, email, relationship, and habit, fed into a database that could then map your behavioral patterns, predict your decisions, and model your intentions. A complete digital shadow of a human being, built in real time. Congress and privacy advocates lost their minds. The program was publicly eviscerated, and on February 4th, 2004, DARPA quietly canceled LifeLog, citing, and this is the actual official quote, a change in priorities. That same day, February 4th, 2004. A 19-year-old Harvard sophomore named Mark Zuckerberg launched a website called The Facebook Now. To be clear, there is no verified evidence of a direct connection. DARPA has denied it. Zuckerberg has never been asked about it in any serious forum. The official story is that this is a coincidence, or a strange, specific, documented coincidence between a canceled government surveillance program and the founding of a platform that would go on to voluntarily collect, in granular detail, the locations, relationships, communications, habits, purchases, and behavioral patterns of 3 billion people. The thing LifeLog couldn't build because the public wouldn't allow it. Facebook built it. Except this time, people filled it in themselves, tagged their own locations, uploaded their own photos, mapped their own social graphs, handed over the data with both hands in exchange for the ability to show people what they had for dinner. The government's dream was a database of human experience too invasive to exist. What replaced it was a database of human experience so irresistible that 2 billion people built it for free. Whether that's a conspiracy or just the most disturbing coincidence in the history of technology is a question nobody in an official position seems particularly interested in answering. Story 7. In 1948, Idaho had a beaver problem. Post-war residents were flooding into rural areas, and the beavers already living there were not happy about it. Wildlife officials needed to relocate them to remote wilderness. Except the terrain had no roads, mules refused to carry panicked rodents, and the whole operation was a logistical mess. So a biologist named Elmo Heater did what any reasonable post-war American would do and reached for the surplus military parachutes. He designed wooden crates that would pop open on impact, tested them with dummy weights, and then recruited a test subject, an old, patient male beaver the team named Geronimo, who was put in a box and thrown out of a plane, over and over, again and again. Each time he landed, he climbed out, waited calmly for someone to collect him, and crawled back into the box. 76 beavers were eventually airdropped into the Idaho wilderness. All but one survived. The descendants of those beavers are still out there today, building dams in what is now the largest protected roadless forest in the lower 48 states. Geronimo himself got first-class passage on the inaugural drop, with 3 females for company. He earned it. But why was the beaver named Geronimo in the first place? Because of paratroopers. In 1940, at Fort Benning, Georgia, a soldier named Private Aubrey Eberhart, drunk on the night before the first ever U.S. Army parachute test jump, made a bet with his unit that he'd be so fearless walking out that door that he'd yell a name at the top of his lungs to prove it. He'd just watched a Western film about an Apache war chief. Out the door he went. Geronimo! The whole unit adopted it. The Army's 1st Parachute Battalion put it on their insignia. It spread across the military, into pop culture, into the vocabulary of every kid jumping off a diving board ever since. And the man behind the name, the actual Geronimo, was born Goyakla, meaning one who yawns. He never called himself Geronimo. The name came from Mexican soldiers who were so terrified fighting him that they screamed out to Saint Jerome, San Jeronimo, for divine protection mid-battle. The Spanish version of Jerome stuck. He accepted it. He eventually rode in Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration parade, sold autographed photos of himself, and died a prisoner of war in Oklahoma, never allowed to return to his homeland. So the next time someone jumps off something and yells it, that sound traveled from a frightened Mexican soldier praying to a saint, to a war chief who never chose his own name, to a drunk private at Fort Benning, to a very patient beaver in a box over Idaho, all the way to whatever ledge your friend is standing on right now. Story 8. Before you dismiss the Appalachian haunted thing as TikTok folklore, consider this. The Appalachian Mountains are older than Saturn's rings, older than the ozone layer, older than sexually reproducing life. The rocks at their core formed nearly 1.2 billion years ago. They were once as tall as the Himalayas. What you're walking through is the worn-down skeleton of something that predates almost everything on Earth. That age accumulates. Thousands of years of indigenous history, Cherokee, Shawnee, Lenape, each with their own knowledge of what lives in those mountains and what you don't do to invite its attention. Then centuries of Scots-Irish isolation were so complete that parts of the range weren't properly surveyed until the 20th century. Whole communities developing their own rules about the woods, passing them down, with nobody from outside ever arriving to tell them they were wrong. The Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina have been documented since 1913. The U.S. Geological Survey investigated and blamed car headlights. Then a flood in 1916 washed out every road and bridge in the area for weeks. The lights kept appearing. Scientists from Appalachian State University captured what they believe are images of them in 2016 and still have no explanation. Hundreds of people have vanished in these mountains in ways that don't match the terrain. The canopy is so dense that search helicopters cannot see through it. There are hollows no living person has entered in recorded memory. Haunted is just the word people use when something is beyond their ability to explain. The mountain doesn't need a ghost. It's been here 1 billion years. You've been here 20 minutes. Story 9. Somewhere on the internet, there is a collection of audio files, soothing background noise, ticking metronomes, synthetic high-pitched voices generated by text-to-speech software that are specifically engineered to make you stop being yourself, not metaphorically. The stated goal, written openly in the communities that share them, is to install a new persona in the listener's mind. Obedient, vacant, pleasurable, a character called Bambi. And the files are designed so that outside of a listening session, you supposedly cannot remember what was said to you. This is Bambi Sleep. It sits under the umbrella of erotic hypnosis, a legitimate subculture of consensual kink that's been around for decades. Most of it is harmless fantasy play. But Bambi Sleep is specifically designed around progressive conditioning, each file building on the last, embedding triggers deeper, making disengagement harder. The audio is deliberately constructed to overload the brain's critical processing so suggestions absorb more readily. That's not speculation. It's described in the material itself, with a straightforwardness that should give anyone pause. The communities around it report a wide spread of experiences. Some describe it as liberating, a space to explore identity, femininity, submission, without it bleeding into real life. Others describe something that looks clinically like addiction, compulsive listening, difficulty stopping, personality changes, impacts on work and relationships. People who went in curious and came out unsure which thoughts were theirs. What makes this genuinely interesting, rather than just disturbing, is the psychology underneath it. Humans have always sought ways to escape the weight of their own identity. Every religion, every substance, every ideology that ever spread offers some version of the same thing. Stop thinking so hard. Let go. Become something simpler. Bambi Sleep is just the version the internet built, with better audio production and a Patreon page. The question isn't whether hypnosis can really rewrite your personality. The question is why so many people are so desperate for someone to try. Story 10. A ghostly face. No records, no answers. Decades of internet speculation. And an explanation so mundane, it almost makes it sadder. Late at night on January 14, 1989, after Chicago's NBC affiliate WMAQ signed off for the evening, something unusual appeared on screen. A blurry, barely legible photo. A name, Joanna Lopez. A Chicago police phone number. No age, no height, no description, no context. Just a face that looked more like a smear than a person, staring out of the static. Then it was gone. 2 years later, on the same date, the same slide reappeared on the same station, clearer this time, lasting 10 seconds, before cutting abruptly to a test pattern, and then nothing. No follow-up, no news story, no police record, no case file. Armchair detectives have spent years searching every database, every archive, every digitized Chicago newspaper from the era. Joanna Lopez does not appear to exist. The internet, predictably, lost its mind. Except here is what almost certainly happened, layered so boringly on top of itself that it produced something that looks, from the outside, exactly like a ghost story. She was reported missing. She was found, quickly, probably the same day or within days, and the case was closed before it generated any significant paperwork. In 1980s Chicago, a resolved missing persons file had no reason to persist. Cases were routinely expunged, archived off-site, or simply never digitized. The phone number on the slide was a general Chicago PD line, not a dedicated tip line, which tells you everything about how seriously anyone expected it to run. The photo looks paranormal because it's a Xerox copy of someone in oversized 1980s sunglasses with light reflecting off the lenses, shot on low-grade equipment, duplicated onto broadcast-quality tape that then degraded over years in a storage facility, then digitized, then compressed for YouTube. Every step of that chain costs fidelity. The face dissolves not because something is wrong with it, but because that's what time does to tape. The slide reappeared in 1991 because it was physically attached to the end of a reel of stock footage that got pulled from archives and reused. Nobody noticed. Nobody checked. Someone in a broadcast booth just ran the tape. She's been found online. Someone contacted her. She didn't deny it. She just didn't want to talk about it, which is the entirely reasonable response of a private person who went missing briefly in 1989 and has since spent 30 years being the subject of creepypasta videos. The mystery isn't that she vanished. It's that the internet found a way to haunt her anyway. Story 11. Mathematics is supposed to be the one discipline where things are either true or they aren't. No ambiguity, no interpretation. You follow the logic, you get the answer, and the answer doesn't care what you think about it, which is why what Georg Cantor did in the 1870s was so destabilizing that the mathematical establishment of his era tried to destroy his career over it. He proved that some infinities are larger than other infinities, not metaphorically, formally. The infinity of real numbers is probably mathematically larger than the infinity of whole numbers. Hilbert called it a paradise. Poincaré called it a disease. Cantor had a breakdown and died in a sanatorium. What Cantor opened, Gödel walked through 60 years later and burned down from the inside. In 1931, Kurt Gödel proved his incompleteness theorems, two results so unsettling that mathematicians spent years hoping he'd made an error. He hadn't. The first theorem says that in any sufficiently powerful logical system, there exist statements that are true but unprovable within that system. The second says the system cannot prove its own consistency. Mathematics cannot fully validate itself. There is an irreducible core of unknowability baked into the foundations of formal reasoning, and there is no way to eliminate it without breaking something else. This is where it stops being abstract. Cryptography, the thing protecting your bank account, your messages, your identity online, is built almost entirely on problems that are computationally hard but not provably hard. We believe factoring large numbers into primes is difficult. RSA encryption, the backbone of most of the internet, depends on that belief. But nobody has proven it must be hard. It's an assumption, a very well-tested assumption, but still an assumption sitting directly over a Gödelian void, a place where the proof may simply not exist, or may exist and be inaccessible, or may never be found because the question itself is undecidable. The field is quietly reckoning with this now. Ultra-finitists argue we should abandon infinity entirely as a mathematical object, that Cantor's paradise was always a cathedral built on sand. Constructivists insist a proof should only count if it actually constructs the thing it claims exists. And underneath all of it is the same unresolved question Gödel left on the table. If a statement is true but unprovable, in what sense is mathematics discovering reality? And in what sense is it just a very elaborate, internally consistent story we are telling ourselves? Your password is protected by a problem nobody can solve. Nobody has proven it can't be solved, and the proof that it can't be solved may not exist. Sleep well. Story 12. Most people look at ham radio and see something their grandfather did. A dusty transceiver in a garage. A guy in a cardigan talking to someone in Ohio at 2 a.m. for reasons nobody fully understands. And that's fair, because from the outside, it genuinely looks like a relic. What it actually is, once you're inside it, is one of the last hobbies with no ceiling. You can spend 50 years in it and still not reach the end. The entry point is deceptively simple. A multiple choice exam, a cheap handheld radio, your local repeater network. You talk to people in your city. Fine. Normal. And then someone mentions HF bands, and suddenly you're reading about propagation, about how shortwave radio bounces off the ionosphere and can reach the other side of the planet, about how the sun's activity directly affects which frequencies work on which day, about how operators chase these windows the way surfers chase swells. You are now doing amateur meteorology and solar physics to decide where to point your antenna. Then there's digital modes, FT8, JS8 call, WSPR, where operators transmit data packets so compressed and error-corrected that a signal weaker than a watch battery can cross an ocean and be decoded. People run automated stations that map signal propagation globally in real time, building a live picture of the ionosphere from the ground up. There are operators doing moon bounce, EME, Earth-Moon-Earth, literally aiming a signal at the lunar surface and receiving the reflection 2.5 seconds later, with equipment built in a shed. And underneath all of it is something the internet quietly killed everywhere else. A genuinely decentralized, unlockable, infrastructure-independent communication network that works when everything else has failed, that requires real knowledge to operate, and that connects you to a global community of people who built their own gear, learned their own craft, and still find the whole thing as interesting as the day they started. The technician exam takes a weekend to study for. What comes after it has taken people entire lifetimes. Nobody who goes deep ever really comes back out. Story 13. In 1894, a young man named Max Planck was advised by his professor not to study physics. The field, he was told, was essentially finished. Newton had explained motion. Maxwell had unified electricity, magnetism, and light into one elegant framework. The major work was done. What remained were just the details, filling in the decimal places. Planck ignored the advice. Within a decade, he had accidentally detonated the foundations of everything his professor had been so confident about. The crack appeared in 1887 when Michelson and Morley ran an experiment to measure the speed of the Earth through the luminiferous ether, the invisible medium that light was assumed to travel through, the way sound travels through air. The experiment was meticulous, the equipment precise, and the result was nothing. No ether, no detectable motion. Light moved at the same speed, regardless of direction, regardless of how fast the Earth was moving. This was not a small anomaly. It meant that something fundamental about space, time, and motion was wrong, and nobody could agree on what. Einstein was 26, working in a Swiss patent office, when he published 4 papers in a single year, 1905, any one of which would have made him the most important physicist of his generation. One explained Brownian motion. One explained the photoelectric effect, for which he would win the Nobel Prize. One introduced special relativity, dissolving the idea of absolute time and establishing that the speed of light is constant and everything else, including time itself, bends around it. He was a clerk. He had no laboratory. His citations were sparse. He just thought about it until it was resolved. But special relativity only covered objects moving at constant velocity. 10 years later, general relativity swallowed gravity itself, reframing it not as a force, but as the curvature of space-time caused by mass. Space and time were not a fixed stage on which the universe performed. They were actors. They bent. They stretched. A clock runs slower near a massive object. GPS satellites have to correct for relativistic time dilation, or they'd accumulate errors of kilometers per day. Meanwhile, Planck, Bohr, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger were dismantling the small end of reality with equal violence. Quantum mechanics emerged from the wreckage, a framework so successful and so deeply strange that Feynman later said, "If you think you understand it, you don't understand it." Einstein never accepted it. He and Bohr argued about it for 30 years, at conferences, in letters, in thought experiments designed to destroy each other's positions. Neither man won. Both were right about different things. The argument is technically still open. Physics went from nearly finished to irreparably fractured in a single human lifetime. We now have 2 theories, relativity and quantum mechanics, each internally consistent, each extraordinarily well tested, and each fundamentally incompatible with the other. The unification of those 2 frameworks is the biggest unsolved problem in science. It has been unsolved for 100 years. The people working on it today are working on something their great-grandparents thought would take a decade. Story 14. The problem with measuring a tornado's wind speed is that anything capable of surviving inside one, long enough to take a reading, gets destroyed by the thing it's measuring. Anemometers get shredded. Instrument pods get thrown. The most violent tornadoes on record, the ones that scour the asphalt off roads and debark trees by sandblasting them with debris, essentially vaporize anything you put in their path. For most of meteorological history, wind speeds in violent tornadoes were estimated from damage, which is like trying to measure a car's speed by examining the skid marks. The Doppler on wheels changed that. The DIW is exactly what it sounds like, a truck with a radar dish on the back, designed to be driven as close to a tornado as physically survivable, and scan the internal wind field from outside it. The radar bounces microwave pulses off debris and rain inside the vortex, and reads the Doppler shift, the way the return frequency changes depending on whether the material is moving toward or away from the beam. From that shift, you get velocity. Real, direct, measured velocity, not estimated from snapped telephone poles. On May 3, 1999, the DIW pulled up near Bridge Creek, Oklahoma, as an F5 tornado reached peak intensity. The reading it returned was 321 miles per hour, the highest wind speed ever reliably measured at or near the Earth's surface, anywhere in any storm. The record stood for 25 years. In May 2024, a DIW intercepted the Greenfield, Iowa tornado and returned readings of 308 to 318 mph. Not quite Bridge Creek, but close enough to confirm that the upper boundary of what a tornado can do is somewhere in that range, and we are only just now developing the tools to find it. What makes the velocity data genuinely strange is what it reveals about tornado structure. The peak winds don't fill the whole vortex. They occur in subvortices, small, intense, rotating columns within the main funnel that can locally exceed the surrounding winds by over 100 mph. They last fractions of a second at specific locations. The Greenfield peak readings, scientists noted, likely occurred for less than a second at any given point in town. A house in their path and a house 50 feet away experienced completely different storms. The EF scale, the official tornado rating, is based entirely on damage, not measured winds. Bridge Creek was an F5. Greenfield was rated EF4. The wind speeds were nearly identical. The scale doesn't care what the radar says, it cares what's left standing. Story 15. The number gets thrown around so often, it stops meaning anything. 50%. But try to actually hold that in your mind for a moment. Not a statistic, a reality. Every other person you know. Your street is half empty, half the farmers are gone, which means half the harvest rotting in fields nobody is alive to bring in. Half the priests died, which meant nobody to administer last rites, which in medieval Catholic Europe meant your soul was in genuine jeopardy on top of your body. Half the craftsmen, the merchants, the midwives, the blacksmiths, the people who knew how things worked, gone, faster than knowledge could be transferred. The Black Death arrived in Sicily in October 1347 on Genoese trading ships. Sailors were found at the oars, dead or so diseased that port authorities ordered the ships out of harbor immediately. It was already too late. Within 3 years, it had moved from Sicily to Norway. It killed so fast and so indiscriminately that social order didn't collapse gradually. It snapped. Lords died alongside serfs, bishops alongside beggars. The feudal hierarchy that had structured European life for centuries depended entirely on enough people being alive to maintain their roles. When half of them weren't, the roles dissolved. Entire villages were abandoned mid-life. Archaeologists still find them. Deserted medieval villages, hundreds of them across England alone, where the streets and building foundations are still visible from the air. But nobody has lived there since the 1350s. The people just stopped. Doors left open, fields left plowed, animals wandering. Chronicles from the period describe a specific, recurring detail that appears across different countries and languages. The sound of bells, constant bells, because the one thing there was never a shortage of was the dead. What the collapse produced over the following decades was something nobody planned and nobody predicted. With half the agricultural workforce gone, the surviving peasants found themselves in possession of something they had never had before: leverage. Lords who needed their fields worked had to negotiate. Wages rose. Serfdom, the system that had kept the rural poor in hereditary bondage for centuries, began to crack under the simple pressure of supply and demand. The plague didn't intend to free anyone. It just removed enough people that the ones left could finally say no. Half the continent died. The half that survived inherited a world where the old rules no longer had enough people to enforce them. Story 16. For roughly 30 years, Alzheimer's research operated under a single organizing idea. The disease is caused by the buildup of sticky protein plaques, amyloid beta, in the brain. Clear the plaques, stop the disease. It was elegant, it was well supported by early evidence, and it attracted the majority of funding and pharmaceutical investment in the field. Drug after drug was developed to target amyloid. Trial after trial was launched, and trial after trial failed to slow cognitive decline, even when the drug successfully cleared the plaques exactly as intended. That last part is the part that should have triggered more alarm than it did. The plaques came out. The patients kept deteriorating, which suggests either the timing was wrong, the hypothesis was incomplete, or the plaques were never the primary cause to begin with. Maybe just a symptom or a consequence of something happening deeper and earlier that nobody had properly identified. The field largely responded by arguing for earlier intervention and better drug design. A smaller contingent argued the entire framework needed rethinking. Then in 2022, a science investigation revealed that a landmark 2006 study, one that had supercharged amyloid funding and directed the field's focus for nearly 2 decades, contained apparently doctored images. Proteins shown to support the research premise had been manipulated. The paper was retracted in 2024. By that point, NIH funding for the specific amyloid subtype it promoted had grown from near zero to over $3,053 million annually. Hundreds of trials had been built on top of it. The careers of researchers, the pipelines of pharmaceutical companies, the hopes of millions of families, all downstream of a paper that may have been fabricated. The field is now quietly and uncomfortably diversifying. Tau proteins, neuroinflammation, the gut-brain axis, vascular disease, circadian rhythm disruption, lipid metabolism. In 2024, there were 182 active clinical trials for Alzheimer's, and for the first time, fewer than a third of them targeted amyloid. The disease is almost certainly not one thing. There are probably several converging processes that look identical by the time symptoms appear, which is why every drug designed to block one of them has barely moved the needle. What we know is that something begins to erase a person. Their memories, their personality, their ability to recognize the people they love, years or decades before the first symptom surfaces. What we don't know is what starts it. After 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars, that is still the honest answer. Story 17. Antarctica is the only continent with no indigenous population, no permanent civilian residents, and an international treaty signed by every major world power that prohibits military activity, resource extraction, and, crucially, independent civilian access. 54 countries that agree on almost nothing else all agreed on this in 1959, without much public debate. That alone is enough to make a certain kind of person very suspicious. The conspiracy theories around Antarctica aren't random. They cluster around a few real, documented, genuinely strange facts that don't have fully satisfying explanations. In 1946, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump. 4,700 personnel, 70 ships, 13 aircraft, led by Admiral Richard Byrd, officially described as a training exercise and mapping mission. It was scheduled to run for 6 months. It was shut down after 40 days. No detailed public explanation was ever given. Byrd later made comments in interviews about the need to defend against hostile aircraft coming from the polar regions, which his defenders say referred to the Soviet Union, and which everyone else has been arguing about ever since. Then there are the German expeditions. Germany sent a documented expedition to Antarctica in 1938-39, claimed a territory they named New Swabia, and, according to declassified intelligence reports, continued submarine activity in the region through the end of the war. Whether any of that involved actual installations is unproven. What is proven is that it happened, that it was taken seriously by Allied intelligence, and that several senior Germans disappeared after the war in ways that have never been fully accounted for. The Google Earth angle is where it gets less serious, but more fun. The pyramids, spotted in satellite imagery of the Ellsworth Mountains, are almost certainly nunataks, peaks of rock protruding through glacial ice, shaped by erosion into geometric forms that look, from above, disturbingly deliberate. The blurred or missing patches of Antarctic imagery are almost certainly stitching artifacts from composite satellite data. Almost certainly. What makes Antarctica uniquely fertile for conspiracy theories isn't what's there. It's the structure of the situation, a vast, inaccessible place, controlled by international agreement, where the people who have been there can't tell you everything they saw, and where the official explanations for the unusual things are always just slightly less satisfying than the question deserves. That gap is where every good conspiracy theory lives. Antarctica has more gaps than almost anywhere else on Earth. Story 18. The entry point is completely reasonable. FEMA recommends every household maintain a 72-hour emergency supply of food, water, and medicine. Most people don't have it. The people who go looking for guidance on how to build one discover a community so vast, so internally detailed, and so convinced that 72 hours is nowhere near enough that a significant percentage of them never really come back out. The prepper community has its own taxonomy. Tier 1 is the sensible end. Extra food, water filtration, basic first aid, a go bag by the door. Tier 2 is where it starts getting interesting. Off-grid power, seed banks, ham radio, medical training beyond basic first aid, a working knowledge of water sourcing and purification without infrastructure. By Tier 3, you are learning to tan hides. You have a dedicated root cellar. You have thought seriously about defensive perimeters. And you have opinions, strong opinions, about the relative merits of freeze-dried versus dehydrated food that you will share with anyone who asks, and several people who didn't. Then there is the bunker economy, a genuine multi-billion-dollar industry that has grown up around high-net-worth individuals who have decided that a well-stocked pantry is insufficient. Vivos X Point in South Dakota is a former U.S. Army munitions depot converted into 575 private bunker units, sold to individual families. Survival Condo in Kansas is a decommissioned Atlas missile silo converted into luxury underground apartments with a pool, a cinema, a dog park, and a full hydroponic system capable of feeding residents indefinitely. Units sold for up to $3 million. It's sold out. What the community has built, quietly and largely without mainstream attention, is a parallel infrastructure for civilization. Forums with millions of members debating water-to-person ratios for 90-day scenarios. YouTube channels dedicated entirely to testing whether specific gear actually performs under real conditions. Medical guides written for people who may have to perform surgery without a hospital. A complete working shadow version of the knowledge that industrial society has made unnecessary, and which a surprisingly large number of people have decided they would rather have anyway. The interesting thing about the prepper community isn't how extreme it gets. It's that the further in you go, the harder it becomes to find the point where the preparation stops being reasonable. Story 19. Tartary was a real place. From the 1500s through to the early 1800s, European cartographers labeled a vast territory spanning Central Asia, Siberia, and beyond as Tartaria. It appeared on serious maps, in encyclopedias, in diplomatic correspondence. Then, over the course of the 19th century, it quietly disappeared from the maps as the Russian Empire expanded and the region got carved into named territories. That disappearance, entirely mundane from a historical standpoint, is the crack that the modern conspiracy theory crawled through. The theory, which began circulating online around 2016, goes like this. Tartaria was not just a geographic label. It was a globe-spanning advanced civilization with free wireless energy, extraordinary architecture, and a level of technology that dwarfed anything supposedly happening in the 19th century. Sometime between roughly 1800 and 1900, the theory is deliberately vague on dates. A catastrophic mud flood wiped most of it out. Cities were buried. Populations were killed or displaced. The surviving buildings were looted, repurposed, and given false histories by the emerging powers who wanted the old world forgotten. The evidence, according to believers, is everywhere once you know how to look. Buildings with basement windows at ground level, not below ground, which means the ground rose around them, which means something deposited meters of material over the original street level. Grand 19th century architecture, the U.S. Capitol, Old Penn Station, the World's Fair pavilions, Beaux-Arts civic buildings across every major city. Too ornate, too large, too technically ambitious for a society supposedly just industrializing. Old photographs of newly built cities showing streets already rutted and worn, buildings already weathered, with barely any construction equipment or workers in sight. Who built all of this, and where did they go? The orphan trains are the detail that stops people cold. Between 1854 and 1929, roughly 250,000 children, real, documented, historical fact, were transported by train from eastern cities to rural areas across America, placed with families, and put to work. The official explanation is urban poverty relief. The Tartaria theory's explanation is repopulation. The cities had been emptied by the reset, and children were being distributed to inhabit them again. One writer described it as the QAnon of architecture, which is either a devastating dismissal or, depending on your priorities, a reason to look closer. The theory has no fixed date, no named perpetrators, no clear mechanism, and that's precisely why it's so hard to dislodge. Every ornate old building becomes evidence. Every demolished landmark becomes a cover-up. Every gap in the historical record becomes the outline of something that was erased. You are not looking at the past. You are looking at what they left behind after they buried the rest. Story 20. On the evening of February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine was sitting quietly at anchor in Havana Harbor when something detonated with enough force to kill 268 of her 355 crew in under a minute. The forward third of the ship was obliterated. What remained sank in shallow water. And from that moment forward, the question of what actually caused it has been argued over, reinvestigated, modeled by computers, and still, after more than a century, not conclusively resolved. The 1898 Naval Board of Inquiry concluded it was a mine, an external explosion beneath the hull that detonated the forward magazines. The evidence they pointed to was the shape of the damage. The keel bent upward in a way that suggested force coming from below. Spain was blamed. Remember, the Maine became the rallying cry that pushed the United States into the Spanish-American War within months. The conclusion was exactly what the political moment required, delivered with the speed the political moment demanded. The Navy's own ordnance expert said publicly, days after the explosion, that the damage looked like a magazine explosion, internal, not external. The chief engineer doubted the mine theory entirely. Neither man was called to testify. Between 1895 and 1898, 13 other American ships had experienced fires caused by spontaneous combustion in coal bunkers. The Maine's coal bunker, A-16, sat separated from the forward ammunition magazine by a single quarter-inch steel bulkhead. The coal loaded into that bunker was bituminous, the type most prone to spontaneous combustion, and had been sitting there for nearly 3 months. In 1976, Admiral Hyman Rickover conducted a fresh investigation in the aftermath of Vietnam, when appetite for questioning official military narratives was rather higher than usual. His conclusion: internal explosion, spontaneous coal combustion, no mine, no Spanish sabotage. In 1998, a National Geographic computer model agreed. simulating that a coal fire in bunker A16 could have raised the temperature of the nearest gunpowder canister to ignition point within 4 hours. The ship blew itself up. Spain started a war it had nothing to do with. The wreck was raised in 1911, reinvestigated, and resunk in deep water off Cuba in 1912, before anyone could reach a definitive conclusion from the physical evidence. Whether that was incompetence, indifference, or something more deliberate is a question the record does not answer. What it does answer is this: the United States fought a war, acquired an empire, and killed an unknowable number of people over an explosion that the best available evidence now suggests was an accident. Nobody has ever formally acknowledged that. Story 21. The entry point is a single, genuinely strange fact. You can train yourself to become conscious inside a dream while the dream is still happening. Not wake up, stay asleep, stay in the dream, and know that you're dreaming, which means you can then do whatever you want in it. Fly, revisit places, have conversations with people who don't exist, build things. The physics are entirely negotiable because your brain is the physics engine, and you are now aware enough to argue with it. The techniques for getting there are where the rabbit hole begins. Reality checks, pinching your nose and trying to breathe through it, because in a dream you can, and doing this dozens of times a day until the habit bleeds into sleep. Dream journals, kept by the bed, written in immediately on waking before the memory dissolves. Because the more attention you pay to your dreams, the more vivid and retrievable they become. Wild, wake-initiated lucid dreaming, where you stay conscious through the transition from wakefulness into sleep, riding the hypnagogic hallucinations until the dream assembles around you while you watch. Mild, WBTEB, wake back to bed, setting an alarm for 5 a.m., staying awake for 90 minutes, then returning to sleep directly into RM. Each technique has its own subreddit, its own advocates, its own failure modes and horror stories, because it does go wrong. Sleep paralysis, the state where you're conscious but your body is still chemically immobilized, is a frequent companion to aggressive lucid dreaming practice. And it is genuinely terrifying in a way that is difficult to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. The hypnagogic hallucinations that accompany the transition can be photorealistic, deeply strange, and occasionally indistinguishable from reality in the moment. There are forum threads from people who struggled for months to tell the difference between being awake and being in a dream, which sounds like a spiritual achievement until you are standing in your kitchen at 3 a.m. genuinely unsure which one you're in. The deep end of the community has built an entire vocabulary and practice around what happens once basic lucidity is achieved. Stabilization techniques, spinning in place, rubbing your hands together to prevent the dream from collapsing when your conscious mind gets too excited. Shared dreaming, whether two people can occupy the same dream space, which has never been scientifically demonstrated and which the community debates with the intensity of a doctoral thesis defense. Dream characters that resist control, develop apparent autonomy, and say things their dreamer claims they couldn't have constructed themselves. You have approximately 2 hours of REM sleep per night. The community's position is that most people are leaving all of it completely unused. Whether that's an opportunity or an obligation depends entirely on how you feel about the idea of a second life running parallel to your first one every single night that you are currently sleeping through. Story 22. Fire a single electron at a barrier with 2 slits in it and something impossible happens. The electron doesn't go through one slit or the other. It goes through both simultaneously, interfering with itself on the other side, producing a wave pattern on the back wall. It behaves like a wave spread across space until you place a detector at the slits to observe which one it goes through. The moment you measure it, the wave collapses into a single point. The interference pattern disappears. The electron picks a path. Reality, apparently, does not commit to specifics until someone is watching. This is not a metaphor. It is one of the most rigorously tested results in the history of science, and it has been driving physicists to quiet professional despair for 100 years. The Copenhagen interpretation, the dominant framework, says the wave function simply collapses on measurement, and you shouldn't ask what was happening before. Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation, proposed in 1957 and taken increasingly seriously by physicists today, says nothing collapses at all. Every possible outcome happens. The universe branches. Every branch is real. You just find yourself on one of them. Quantum immortality is what happens when you apply that logic to consciousness and survival. If every possible outcome of every quantum event branches into its own universe, then in any situation where you might die, there is a branch where you don't. And because your consciousness is the observer, the thing that collapses experience into a single lived timeline, it can only ever find itself on a branch where it continues to exist. From the inside, you always survive. Every near miss, every moment where the odds were against you, every car crash and close call, on your timeline, you made it. You will always make it, because the you that didn't is not here to notice. This is where the philosophy stress tests itself. Quantum immortality is unfalsifiable by design. If it's true, you can never experience the branch where it fails, so you can never disprove it from the inside, which means it is either a genuine structural feature of conscious experience or a very elegant way of making survivorship bias sound like a law of physics. The people most drawn to it tend to be the people who have already had the near misses. The theory does not explain why they survived. It just tells them they were always going to. The double-slit experiment proved that observation shapes reality at the quantum level. Whether your consciousness is the kind of observer that keeps your universe running, or whether the universe was already indifferent to you long before you started watching, is a question physics can set up but cannot answer. You are either the protagonist of a self-sustaining timeline, or you are a pattern of atoms that got lucky so far. Both interpretations are consistent with everything that has happened to you. Only one of them changes how you live. Story 23. In 1983, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel named Wayne McDonnell submitted a report to the CIA titled Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. It was classified. It was declassified in 2003 and quietly filed in the CIA's FOIA reading room, where it sat largely unread until the internet found it and had an extremely predictable reaction. Because the report, written on official government letterhead by a military officer for one of the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth, is a serious attempt to explain how to achieve out-of-body experiences using sound. The Gateway Process was developed by Robert Monroe, a Virginia businessman who in the 1950s began spontaneously leaving his body during sleep experiments and decided to figure out how to do it reliably and teach it to others. His method was hemisync, binaural beats, different frequencies played into each ear simultaneously, designed to synchronize the electrical activity of the brain's left and right hemispheres into a single coherent wave pattern. Monroe found that in this state, something happened that he couldn't explain and couldn't stop reporting. Consciousness appeared to detach from the physical body. He built an institute around it. Thousands of people went through the program. Enough of them described the same experiences that the U.S. Army decided it warranted a formal assessment. McDonnell's report moves through neuroscience, physics, and holographic universe theory before arriving at a framework where human consciousness, sufficiently synchronized, drops below a threshold frequency and clicks out of space-time entirely, briefly joining what the report calls infinity, a state outside of space and time where all information is accessible simultaneously. This is the section that made the document legendary, not because it's obviously true, because a U.S. Army officer wrote it in 1983 for the CIA using the language of physics, and nobody apparently told him to stop. The released version of the document is missing page 25. Nobody has ever officially explained why. When it was eventually located and published by Vice in 2021, it contained the framework for how a consciousness operating outside space-time might interact with and retrieve information from other locations and times, which is to say, it was the page that connected Gateway to the remote viewing programs the CIA was running simultaneously: Stargate, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, in which trained operators were paid government salaries to close their eyes and describe places they had never been. The people who go through the Gateway tapes today, available freely online, describe a remarkably consistent set of experiences: vibrations, separation, a perspective from outside the body that feels more real than ordinary perception. Some describe it as the most significant experience of their lives. Some describe it as irreversible in the sense that you cannot go back to believing what you believed before. The CIA studied it because they wanted an operational advantage. Most people who find it aren't looking for that. They're looking for the same thing Monroe was looking for when it started: an explanation for something that happened to them that nothing in the official version of reality accounts for. Story 24. In May 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror left England with 129 men, 3 years of provisions, a hand organ, a library of 1,200 books, and the absolute confidence of the Victorian Empire that they would find the Northwest Passage and return heroes. They were last seen by 2 whalers in Baffin Bay in late July. Then nothing. For 2 years, nothing. Then search parties, then nothing more. Then a note found in a cairn on King William Island in 1859, 14 years after they left, said that Franklin had died in June 1847. 24 others were already dead, and the remaining 105 men had abandoned the ice-locked ships and were walking south, into nothing, into Arctic tundra with no food, no support, and nowhere to go. What killed them took over a century to piece together, and the answer is not one thing. It is several failures stacked so precisely on top of each other that the expedition was probably doomed before it cleared English waters. The tinned food, hailed as the era's cutting-edge technology and loaded in abundance, had been sealed with lead solder. The men ate from those tins for months. Forensic analysis of the 3 bodies found preserved in permafrost on Beechy Island showed catastrophic lead levels, enough to cause confusion, paranoia, poor decision-making, and the kind of neurological deterioration that would make a desperate situation unsurvivable. They were being slowly poisoned by the provisions meant to save them, and they had no way of knowing it. The Inuit had been telling search parties since the 1850s what they had seen: groups of emaciated men dragging boats across the ice, a tent full of bodies, bones that had been cut. Victorian England refused to believe them. It took until the 1980s and 1990s for forensic analysis of skeletal remains to formally confirm what the Inuit had reported without hesitation for 130 years. The survivors had resorted to cannibalism. In October 2024, DNA analysis identified the cannibalized remains of James Fitzjames, captain of the Erebus, one of the most senior officers on the expedition. His bones showed cut marks consistent with the removal of flesh. Neither rank nor status, researchers noted, governed what happened in those final weeks. The Erebus was found in 2014. The Terror in 2016. Both remarkably intact on the seafloor, dishes still in cupboards, boots still by bunks, preserved so well that researchers have been able to map the interior and recover artifacts. The ships outlasted every man aboard them. They are sitting on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean in better condition than the reputations of the people who sent 129 men into the ice without a contingency, without adequate Arctic knowledge, and without the humility to ask the people who actually live there how to survive. The Inuit knew. They always knew. Nobody asked them until it was 170 years too late. Story 25. On July 26, 2023, a decorated combat veteran and former intelligence officer named David Grush sat in front of the United States House Oversight Committee, raised his right hand, and testified under oath that the U.S. government has been operating a covert multi-decade program to retrieve and reverse engineer craft of non-human origin, that it has recovered what he described as non-human biologics from crash sites, that this program has been illegally concealed from congressional oversight, that he personally suffered retaliation for attempting to report it through official channels. This is in the congressional record. It happened. You can watch it. Grush was not a fringe figure dragged in from the internet. He was the National Reconnaissance Office's representative to the Pentagon's UAP task force. He held the kind of clearances that take years to obtain and seconds to lose. His statements were cleared for public disclosure by the Department of Defense's own pre-publication review office before he said them. He was joined at the hearing by Ryan Graves, a former Navy pilot who described encountering UAPs on training missions with such regularity that his squadron considered them a flight safety hazard, and David Fravor, the pilot from the 2004 Tic Tac incident, whose account has never been credibly explained by any conventional means in 20 years of trying. What makes this moment different from every UFO story of the last 70 years is the structural shift underneath it. For decades, the official position was denial. Swamp gas, weather balloons, mass hysteria, nothing to see. Then in 2017, the Pentagon quietly confirmed the existence of a classified UAP investigation program it had been running for years. In 2021, the Director of National Intelligence released a report that formally acknowledged UAPs as a national security concern and admitted that most encounters remain unexplained. In 2023, a credentialed intelligence official said under oath that the craft are not ours and never were. Each step is official. Each step is documented. The line from denial to admission has been moving in one direction for a decade, and nobody in the mainstream conversation seems to want to stand at the end of it and say what it implies. The question the disclosure movement is now asking is not whether non-human intelligence exists or has been present here. The question is what it means that the people who know the most about it have been systematically prevented from telling the people who are supposed to oversee them. That is not a UFO story. That is a story about who controls the most significant information in human history and who decided that Congress, and by extension, everyone else, didn't need to know. They said it under oath, on camera, in the Capitol, and the news cycle moved on in 48 hours. That might be the strangest part of all of it. Story 26. For about 30 years, a significant portion of the population operated under the belief that moderate drinking, a glass of red wine with dinner, a couple of beers on the weekend, was not just acceptable, but possibly beneficial, good for the heart. The French drank wine and had low rates of cardiovascular disease. Studies showed a J curve. Heavy drinkers had terrible health outcomes. Non-drinkers had slightly worse outcomes than moderate drinkers, and moderate drinkers sat in a sweet spot of apparent protection. This became received wisdom. It appeared in newspapers, in dietary guidelines, in conversations between doctors and patients. It was wrong. The problem with those studies was methodological. and it took decades to fully understand. They compared moderate drinkers to non-drinkers, but the non-drinker category was contaminated. It included people who had quit drinking because they were already sick, former heavy drinkers, people managing chronic illness, people whose doctors had told them to stop. When you compare healthy moderate drinkers to that group, of course the moderate drinkers look healthier. You have rigged the comparison without realizing it. The apparent protective effect of alcohol was largely, possibly entirely, a statistical artifact. When researchers used Mendelian randomization, a method that uses genetic variants to approximate a randomized trial, removing the confounding that observational studies can't control for, the heart health benefit of moderate drinking disappeared entirely. What remained was a dose-dependent relationship between alcohol consumption and harm. More alcohol, more risk. No floor below which the risk stopped. In January 2023, the WHO published a statement in The Lancet confirming what the genetic studies had been showing. There is no safe level of alcohol consumption for human health. None. The same Group 1 carcinogen classification that covers asbestos, radiation, and tobacco covers alcohol. It has for decades. Most people have never been told. Alcohol causes at least 7 types of cancer. Half of all alcohol-attributable cancers in Europe are caused by light to moderate drinking, not heavy drinking, light to moderate. Because there are simply so many more people doing it. The breast cancer risk begins before most people would consider themselves drinkers at all. A 2025 draft study found that even the amounts previously considered moderate raise cancer risk, liver disease risk, and injury risk, with no compensating benefit that holds up to scrutiny. None of this means alcohol is going anywhere. But there is a meaningful difference between choosing to drink knowing the actual risk and choosing to drink because someone told you a glass of wine was basically medicine. The second thing was never true. The research that said it was has been quietly dismantled. The cultural story built on top of it is still standing. Story 27. The ocean covers 71% of the Earth's surface. The average depth is 3.7 kilometers. The deepest point, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, is nearly 11 kilometers down, which means if you dropped Mount Everest into it, the summit would still be underwater by more than a mile. We have sent humans to the surface of the moon 6 times. We have sent humans to the bottom of the Challenger Deep twice. The deep ocean is not a place we go. It is a place we occasionally visit at enormous expense and immediately leave. Every time we go, we find things that should not be possible. The vampire squid lives in oxygen minimum zones, so depleted that almost nothing else can survive there. It solved the problem by evolving a metabolism so efficient it can function on oxygen levels that would kill any other animal its size. The barrel-eye fish has a transparent, fluid-filled dome for a head and eyes that rotate inside it, staring upward through its own skull to track prey silhouetted against the faint light above. The siphonophore, a colonial organism that is technically a single animal, can reach 45 meters in length, making it the longest creature ever recorded, and it spends its entire existence in the dark at depth, completely invisible to the surface world, doing whatever it is that a 45-meter transparent colonial organism does with its time. In 2024 alone, researchers described dozens of previously unknown species from a single survey of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Pacific, including an entirely new superfamily of amphipods, a branch of the evolutionary tree that nobody knew existed. A 2024 expedition along the Salas y Gomez Ridge found over 100 potentially new species in 40 days. Scientists estimate that somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million marine species remain undiscovered. Most of them are down there right now. The part that makes sleep difficult is not the creatures themselves. It is the scale of what we don't know. Bioluminescence, the production of light by living organisms, was long considered a rare speciality of a few unusual species. We now believe that roughly 76% of all deep-sea animals produce their own light. The ocean is full of things glowing at each other in the dark, conducting entire lives, entire ecosystems, entire evolutionary dramas across geological time, and we have never seen any of it. We are sitting on the surface of a planet whose largest habitat is essentially unknown, and the things living in it have had 3.5 billion years to get very good at existing. We are not at the top of this food chain. We are barely aware that the food chain exists.